Beloved by fans as the grizzled, good-hearted sidekick of Hollywood's most renowned cowboys, Gabby Hayes wasn't always like that. Even after stepping away from a successful role because to a heated salary disagreement, Gabby Hayes clung to grudges and a strong feeling of pride behind the scenes. His journey from a modest upbringing in New York to complete financial ruin in the stock market crash of 1929 was everything but straightforward. Why was this apparently cheerful man acting so erratically? To harbor such profound resentment until death do us part? Despite popular belief, Gabby Hayes was not always the weathered, crusty old guy. Even though he was a little slower than the cowboy, he was still a formidable sidekick. No, he was once a skinny young man named George Francis Hayes, full of promise and ambition, before he became Gabby. Despite his repeated assertions that he was born in Wellsville, New York, specifically the Hayes Hotel, he was born in New York City. George had 6 siblings when he was a kid. His dad, Clark Hayes, wasn't your average hotelier. He was deeply involved in the petroleum sector, which he helped to launch in that region of the nation. There was continual activity in the Hayes household as guests arrived and left the family hotel. Elizabeth Morrison, George's mother, was perceptive and careful. As a man of many endeavors, Clark brought up his 7 children in a disciplined manner, instilling in them a strong work ethic. Morrison was one of those. The elder brother of George, who became a hero in the end. Morrison served during World War I after enlisting. He was never able to return. Morrison gained a household name after his death in battle in France. He was so influential that the American Legion Post was named for him. Next up came George, who occupied the 7th spot from the center. Perhaps it was the dynamic atmosphere that ignited his own sense of adventure. He was already a semi-pro baseball player when he entered high school. Never satisfied, seeking for the next big thing, the next daring adventure, it was clear that he had talent. However, he finally snapped and couldn't continue. George, who was 17 years old at the time, was fidgety and wanted out of small-town life badly. Thus, he bolted like a character from a fairy tale. Seeking a greater purpose beyond attending baseball games and helping out the family business, he became a member of a traveling stock company. Even a circus was a part of his life for a spell. Though unglamorous, it was necessary for George's financial stability and gave him an appreciation for the theater. Thereafter, the vaudeville circuit. Vaudeville was an entirely new animal, combining musical numbers with comedic and dramatic elements. He poured his heart and soul into perfecting an act that people loved. His over-the-top country boy antics earned him the nickname the Rube Constable, a persona that brought him much comic relief. George honed the comic timing that would serve him well throughout his career on the vaudeville stage. No amount of notoriety, acclaim, or stage fright could have been the genuine turning point in George's life. Ireland, Olive was more than simply a performing company member. She provided a steadying influence on George's untamed nature. Olive was a salesgirl for a dry goods store when she was in her late teens. But she wasn't cut out for that kind of existence. Olive felt the same need for a life beyond their little town that George did. She finally found her niche in the entertainment industry, where her boundless energy and natural skill could truly shine. She danced and acted her way into the illustrious Ziegfeld Follies, where she established a modest but consistent career thanks to her graceful stage presence and innate talent. There was some misunderstanding when she adopted the stage name Dorothy Earle because another actress at the time was also using it. However, Olive's motivation was unrelated to fame. The art was paramount, as was the exhilaration of playing to an actual live audience. This is when she first laid eyes on George. They shared the difficult and frequently demeaning life of a performer as members of the same touring group, playing night after night to audiences that ranged from raving fans to complete strangers. They toured small communities. George, though, couldn't tear his gaze away from Olive. The people around her couldn't help but notice her because of the charisma and self-assurance she exuded. Her charisma and attractiveness weren't the only things that captivated George. The key was her incisive intellect. Olive stood out. She wasn't merely a one-night stand. To him, she was on par. As they went from performance to gig, they would stay up late chatting and sharing their goals and aspirations. Olive was able to see through George's ulterior motives. She recognized George's true nature, charming, headstrong, and hiding insecure feelings beneath his bluster. The link between them was established by 1914. Her absence would be unbearable for George. Their wedding day was March 4th of that year. Olive was just 21 years old, whereas George was 27. Their relationship was more than just passionate from the start. On top of that, it was perfectly executed. Along with him, Olive took the stage as Dorothy Earle. They worked well as a unit. As they performed in each location, their friendship became stronger. They continued to live in this manner for a long time, moving from one stage to another, earning barely enough to cover their expenses. Olive was there for George through thick and thin, encouraging him and showing him how to see beyond his immediate surroundings. Despite never having children of their own, they felt an indestructible bond thanks to the many shared experiences they experienced throughout their lives. George believed he had saved enough money to retire them by the time he was 43 years old. They were prepared to leave the nomadic lifestyle behind when they purchased a house on Long Island. It was meant to be the last tranquil chapter after all their hard work, a spot to unwind and relish in their achievements. At first, things appeared to be going swimmingly for George as he felt he had earned his sleep. The stock market crash of 1929 followed, bringing an end to their financial stability along with it. In an instant, George's life savings were gone. It ruined all their preparations and their hopes for a pleasant retirement. A crushing blow that was. However, George, being the stubborn man that he was, desired to hold on to the little that remained. Perhaps he should remain where he is. Perhaps things could change for the better. On the other hand, Olive couldn't stand it. No woman has she ever waited passively for things to improve. George, she realized, needed a fresh start and a different path. The film business was her nudge, and she wanted him to go there because it was where Hollywood was born. With a composed yet determined tone, she questioned, what are the risks? They persisted because Olive had faith in him. George was encouraged to try his hand at filmmaking by her following the accident. Not that George hadn't given it some thought previously. As a beginner, he had experimented with silent films, although he consistently returned to the stage that best suited him. However, Olive was wiser. He wasn't destined for a career on stage. The talkies were the first cinemas to use sound. Even though he was blind, she could see it. What kept them going was Olive's vision for George's potential. They decided to sell their Long Island property and go to California. George was willing to take the risk with Olive's support, even if it was a difficult decision. George and Olive's future was unclear when they landed in Los Angeles. Back then, Hollywood was wild and full, with performers vying for a piece of the emerging film industry. George had to start all again, and it wasn't easy. But destiny has a way of interfering at the most inconvenient of moments. Trem Carr, a producer, happened to cross paths with George one day. George caught Carr's eye. Perhaps his demeanor was the determining factor. Aged and weathered, yet brimming with determination, George had an attractive, slightly intelligent, and gruff appearance that he appreciated. 2 roles were given to him by Carr. George actually collaborated with Carr on 30 projects during the subsequent 6 years. Nothing was the same after that meeting. At first, George didn't seem like the stereotypical Western hero. He had no background in ranching or riding horses. Upon arriving in Hollywood, he was completely unprepared, not even knowing how to mount a horse. But it didn't deter him. One thing George was good at was adjusting to new situations. As a result, he trained by riding until he was competitive. However, he wasn't playing the role of the heroic gunfighter for which he was famous. From hero to villain, he played them all. It was remarkable how versatile he was. Plus, he has double-starred in other films. However, he truly shone in the Western genre. These weren't the studio-quality, big-budget features. This was not your average Hollywood blockbuster. Rather, it was a low-budget B-Western that delivered adventure after adventure. Both George and the audience adored them. The role of the weathered veteran came easily to him despite the fact that he was far from embodying that persona in real life. George was intelligent, neat, and incisive when he wasn't on film. However, in the film, he played the role of the charming old codger with a beard who had a wise comment for every circumstance. "You're dern tootin' dadgummit and concarnate." His distinctive mannerisms helped to make him famous. Between 1935 to 1939, George landed the role of Windy Halliday, the reliable sidekick of the cowboy hero Hop-along Cassidy. To lighten the mood, George came in, never one to back down when pressure was on, despite constantly fumbling around. Not only was he hilarious, but he was also an admirably courageous and faithful companion. George, however successful, refused to accept anything less than what he believed he was entitled to. George quit his job as Wendy after a salary dispute with Paramount Pictures. It was difficult, but George was self-assured. His acquiescence was brief. He was signed by Republic Pictures, but they had a condition. Republic was unable to utilize the name Windy Halliday since it belonged to Paramount. There was no issue. He was rechristened Gabby Whitaker. And the persona came to life once more. Always riding shotgun with the hero, Gabby remained essentially the same as Windy, that bewhiskered, grumpy, but endearing old man. Gabby managed to stay put this time. Gabby was in over 40 films between 1939 and 1946, with her breakout role being as Roy Rogers' sidekick. Among the other famous people he collaborated with were Gene Autry, Wild Bill Elliott, John Wayne, Randolph Scott, and more. Not every character was the same either. In his villain roles, George portrayed a no-nonsense criminal who could fend off any hero. Audiences were most captivated by Gabby, though. Gabby Hayes became a household name, and George and Gabby became inseparable. For 12 years in a row, he was one of the most beloved actors, according to popular opinion. Envision a supporting character who is as beloved as the main character. George had that little something special to offer every role he played. Even in supporting roles, he managed to steal the show, which is not often seen. And it wasn't limited to westerns either. Comic books written by Gabby Hayes about their beloved grumpy old cowboy were a huge success with children. The western subgenre, however, began to lose favor in the late 1940s. Demand for classic westerns was far lower than it had been in the past due to changing audiences. With 174 westerns under his belt, George was well aware of the genre's limitations and made his final film in 1950. Leaving the world that catapulted him to stardom was an unusual farewell. However, George kept going. He dove headfirst into the uncharted territory of television. The Gabby Hayes Show, George's own television program, premiered in 1950. George would often introduce the stories while whittling wood or telling tall tales on the Western-themed variety show. Even though his days in the movies were over, he continued to play Gabby for the next generation. The show, which was sponsored by Quaker Oats, had several amusing moments. For example, Gabby would shoot cereal from a cannon at the screen, which was a direct reference to Quaker's motto, "Shot from guns." It was quintessential Gabby Hayes, full of life, mischievous, and fun. After a 4-year run on NBC, the show had a short comeback in 1956 on ABC. For George, it was more than simply another job. It marked the end of a legendary career. Quietly leaving the entertainment industry after the performance finished was George. From movies to TV shows to comics. He had done it all, and achieved legendary status as a result. Gabby Hayes was still a cherished character even after retiring. Among his many TV guest spots was a string of appearances on Howdy Doody, where his signature scowl never failed to amuse viewers. His reputation endured, and his works lived on in Gabby Hayes' Western comic books and a summer camp for kids that was named after him. Something about George changed after Olive died in 1957. She had been his steadying presence and equal partner for almost 40 years. Outsiders couldn't have seen how lost he was without her. Everyone still recognized him as Gabby Hayes, the weathered cowboy with a golden soul. However, the genuine George was secretly grieving. Near Toluca Lake, California, he had a property that he frequently visited. It was a tranquil location, away from the cacophony of Hollywood. He and Olive had always found solace at the ranch, Away from the hustle and bustle of city life, there was now only silence, an oppressive silence. George hardly lingered there. In his twilight years, he downsized from the ranch to a modest 10-unit apartment complex he owned. A quiet place to himself where he could think and pass the time was all he needed. George began to experience a decline in his health in early 1969. Though he had worked tirelessly throughout his life, his heart just couldn't handle it all. A man who had previously been full of ferocity and determination had been progressively weakened by cardiovascular illness. For treatment, he checked into Burbank's St. Joseph Hospital. Doctors did their best to stabilize him while he was there for a few weeks. However, George Gabby Hayes peacefully departed from that hospital bed on February 9, 1969, at the age of 83. Word got around fast. A legend had passed away in Hollywood, robbing many people of the delight, mirth, and spirit of adventure that he had offered. His loss was felt by fans nationwide, who will always remember him as more than simply a sidekick. They will remember him as a legend. The Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills Cemetery, where Gabby was laid to rest, is also the final resting place of many other famous people. Even though he passed away, Gabby's brightness remained bright. His recollection endured. His services to both radio and television earned him 2 stars, one on Hollywood Boulevard for his radio work and the other on Vine Street for his television efforts. Those stars would remind people of the scruffy, bearded old codger who used to be on their screens, the one who could always find the perfect words to say. After Gabby Hayes passed away in 2000, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City posthumously inducted him into the Hall of Great Western Performers. It was a just reward for a man who, despite his lack of cowboy heritage, had personified the Wild West. You would never believe that George didn't hail from a ranch or learn to ride a horse until he was in his 40s, judging by his on-screen persona. He convinced you that riding was in his blood from the start. Even after he passed away, Gabby Hayes continued to make headlines. There was an obvious reference to Hayes in the parody Western Blazing Saddles, which had a character named Gabby Johnson and mocked the traditional Western sidekick cliché. The citizens of the town enthusiastically responded to Gabby Johnson's spirited, although entirely incomprehensible, address. This was Gabby's way of paying homage to the type of character she had honed throughout the years, while simultaneously poking fun at her. Next, in Toy Story 2, Gabby was obviously referenced by the character Stinky Pete the Prospector. Toy character Stinky Pete, voiced by Kelsey Grammer, was based on a character from a classic TV Western. Astute allusion to the gap between Gabby Hayes' on-screen and off-screen personas, the toy in the film is articulate and perceptive. George was smart and perceptive in real life, but his fans adored him for playing the fool in films. Johnny Carson and Roy Rogers even did Gabby impressions on The Tonight Show, so Gabby Hayes was definitely in the sketches. It was only one of many ways that George's legacy lived on after he passed away. He had constructed a legendary figure who had grown in stature, representing an enduring appreciation for classic westerns of yesteryear. However, Gabby's legacy remained in more places than only the entertainment industry. The community of Wellsville, New York, where George had spent his formative years, hosted an annual festival known as Gabby Hayes Days from 1983 to 1989. There were street vendors, square dancers, and even contests to see who could look most like their hometown hero, Gabby Hayes. In honor of the man who had brought fame to their community, children and adults alike would don the garish garb of the elderly cowboy. A second Wellsville event later combined with Gabby Hayes Days. But for those years, it was the town's shining moment, a tribute to the star-studded young man who had departed to follow his heart. As a modest but everlasting monument to the guy who had brought joy to so many, Wellsville also has a street named Gabby Hayes Lane, which is named after him. Decades after his passing, Gabby Hayes is still a byword for classic westerns and classic Hollywood.